aquellos que no me conocen, mi nombre es Mindy Heinsohn. Soy de los Estados Unidos, pero llevo 7 años en Puerto Rico. Durante mi tiempo en Puerto Rico, he servido como asistente principal de flauta de la Orquesta Sinfónica de Puerto Rico, flauta principal del International Chamber Orchestra of Puerto Rico y actualmente soy profesora de flauta en el Conservatorio de Música de Puerto Rico. También soy fundadora del Club de Flauta de Puerto Rico, fundadora del Puerto Rico International Flute Festival y cofundadora de Live Performing Arts Studio en Miramar. La presentación de hoy es parte de una serie de clases magistrales de la iniciativa educativa Música Abierta. Antes de comenzar, me gustaría agradecer a Repertoire Musical y Fundación Ángel Ramos por invitarme a compartir un poco sobre la evolución del repertorio para flauta sola con todos ustedes. Además, me gustaría agradecer a Estuardo Linde, fundador de Live Performing Arts Studio en Miramar, por servir como mi sound engineer para la clase magistral de hoy. Ahora voy a cambiar para hablar inglés. I'm going to repeat everything again so that those of you who missed out in the beginning will understand what I said now. Welcome to today's masterclass, which is being sponsored by Repertoire Musical and Fundación Ángel Ramos. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mindy Heinsohn. I'm originally from the United States, but I have lived in Puerto Rico for 7 years. During my time in Puerto Rico, I have served as the assistant principal flute of the Puerto Rico Symphony, principal flute of the International Chamber Orchestra, and I'm currently professor of flute at the Puerto Rico Conservatory of Music. I'm also the founder of the Puerto Rico Flute Club, the Puerto Rico International Flute Festival, and co-founder of Live Performing Arts Studio in Miramar. Today's presentation is an educational initiative called Música Abierta. I would like to personally thank Repertoire Musical and Fundación Ángel Ramos from the bottom of my heart for inviting me to share this class with you today. I would also like to thank my sound engineer, Estuardo Linde of Live Performing Arts Studio, for helping me out with all of the sound needs for today's class. It has truly been a lifesaver to have him helping me. So, today's class or course, you could say, is going to feature different composers and pieces from the repertoire for solo flute. And I kind of wanted to share with you a little bit about how the repertoire developed over the years, over the centuries. And my goal with this course is really just to make it accessible to everyone. Accessible not only to musicians, but to people who aren't musicians as well. Lovers of music, young students, maybe in high school, those of you who are maybe starting to learn some of these pieces, and those of you also studying music professionally or who are professional musicians. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to comment, make a comment below, and I will do my best to check all the comments as we're proceeding through today's class. So, the first piece I would like to start with is by a composer named George Philip Telemann. And for those of you who don't know Telemann, he was a German Baroque composer who lived a very long time ago, from 1681 to 1767. And Telemann played a variety of instruments, but he also played flute himself. And I think that the fact that he played flute does great credit to the wonderful pieces that he gave us for solo flute. And I wanted to start with this piece because apart from Telemann, there are only a few composers who wrote pieces for solo flute at this time that we know of. Obviously the most famous one, other than Telemann, I'm sure a lot of you might have heard of Johann Sebastian Bach. He wrote his partita in A minor for solo flute, and one of his sons, C.P.E. Bach, also wrote a sonata in A minor for solo flute. Apart from that, we have 2 small pieces by Blavet, and forgive me if I'm saying some of these names incorrectly. I'll do my very best. Hoteter wrote a piece called Echoes. There are some arrangements by Michel Delabarre. Beaumartier wrote his suites for solo flute. Robert Carr's Delightful Companion, and Quantz's Caprice. So those are some of the other pieces for solo flute that were written at this time. And what makes Telemann unique in this is that he was one of the few composers of his time who wrote fugues, pasacalles, and a French overture for solo flute specifically. And the piece that I'm going to play a little bit of and share with you today is one of his 12 fantasies for solo flute. It is from a cycle or collection of 12 fantasies. And these fantasies were written specifically for the flute. And they were written in Hamburg, in Germany, and were published sometime around 1727, 1728. Exact date is a bit unclear, but it's more or less around that time. And these pieces were also suitable, I think. They're suitable for flutists of all levels, from beginners to professionals. And these pieces in general, but this particular one has something to offer everyone. And Telemann wrote fantasies not only for flute, but for other instruments. He also wrote for fantasies for viola da gamba, violin, and harpsichord. And each fantasy has its own character and its own form, and each fantasy is a complete work in and of itself. And I wanted to talk about these fantasies because I remember when I started playing these fantasies as a kid, I was maybe 13 or 14, and I just remember feeling like, what is this? Like this is so hard, and there's so many jumps and leaps, and it doesn't make any sense. And of course, over the years, as I studied further and I got more into the style and the composer, all of these things kind of became more clear for me. But I just remember being so confused in the beginning. And I hope for some of you young people who may be flute players who are watching today, I can help give you some insight in how to make some sense of what's going on in all of these notes here. So these sets of pieces were very popular during their time, and each fantasy, as I said before, has its own unique key, form, compositional techniques, number of movements. For example, the Telemann fantasy in A minor has 4 movements, and they're structured in a form of a sonata chiesa, which is slow movement, fast movement, slow movement, fast movement. And what is unique about this particular fantasy is that the prelude, or the first movement, is called grave, and this movement acts as the prelude. And in this particular fantasy, the prelude is a separate movement, which is, it kind of follows the later styles of the preludes and fugues of Johann Sebastian Bach. And some of the other fantasies that are in this collection, the prelude is part of or included in the fast movement. So this one's kind of unique in that it's a separate movement in and of itself. So we can go ahead and switch to the next slide there. So I'm going to start with the prelude itself. And what I want to talk about right away is the character of this. It's short, and it sets, the tone for the whole piece, and it has quite, the prelude has a quite serious, majestic, kind of almost royal kind of character to it. And when I play the prelude, you might feel like something bigger is going to happen, and that's the way that it's meant to be. It's meant to prepare you for the faster movement that's coming afterwards. So for those of you who are musicians, I just want to talk for a second about some, musical terminology. If you look at the first measure of the piece, the harmonic rhythm moves quite slowly, meaning basically the harmony is changing 1 chord per measure. And this kind of creates a heavier, more weighty serious feeling to the prelude. So when performing this movement, I encourage all of you to focus on the bass line, which generally falls on the downbeat of each measure. And in addition to the bass line, I also want to point out that there are two separate voices going on here at the same time. So the first measure, you have the quarter notes, followed by the F quarter note, the Fa natural in the second measure. Then you have a small group of fast moving 16th notes. And these moving 16th notes serve as more of a treble voice here. And they should have a contrasting character to the quarter notes at the beginning. So you might want to play them a bit lighter, use a lighter articulation for the 16th notes and a heavier, more long articulation for the quarter notes. Another thing that I'd like to point out here is, if we go to the next slide, if you look at the E natural that is written in the first measure on the third beat, and you see I have drawn a line over to the E natural in the second measure, this is kind of a delayed suspension of this E natural. So I also like to kind of lengthen the E natural a little bit, just to kind of let the ear kind of grasp onto this idea that, oh, it's going to come back again in the next measure. So what the technique that Telemann is using here is basically he is leaping around in different registers, which gives the illusion that this opening is quite complicated. But in reality, all that's happening is you're never really playing more than one note at a time. And I just kind of want to play the prelude for you by itself so you can hear. What's happening. So, as you can hear at the end, it's like, oh, what's going to happen next, right? So what's going to happen next is the next movement, the vivace, which is a fugue. Now, what is a fugue? Well, a fugue is basically a short melody or subject that is introduced and then taken on by other voices or subjects and then developed, and it's interweaved. And what we have here that makes it very unique is this is actually kind of a double fugue. So we have basically two voices or subjects happening at the same time. So if you have a look at the slide there on the screen, and look at for those of you who are musicians and can read all of these crazy notes here, the bottom staff there, you have the melody is divided into two voices. So you have some notes where the stems are going up and some notes where the stems are going down. The notes that are going up, the stems are going up, is the upper melody. And this subject uses a lot of syncopations, which creates suspension and tension that will only be resolved in the next measure. So it kind of creates this forward-flowing energy to the fugue, to the vivace, and makes it more exciting to listen to. The lower subject uses a lot of chromatic passing tones with a lot of neighbor tones, And so what I'd like to do is just kind of play a couple of those for you so you can get the idea and separate. I'd like to separate the voices so you can hear them. I encourage all of you when you're practicing to do this at home, to separate the voices and work on a round full sound. That is an example of the upper voice. So now you can hear these two voices separately. And now I'd like to just play a little bit of this movement for you, putting those voices together. Okay, so as you can hear, two distinct voices happening, and this pretty much happens throughout the entire movement. If we go on to the next slide, I think you have to go ahead a few slides. Keep going. Another one. Right there. So this is the facsimile manuscript version of this, and you can see here that even Telemann wrote some of the notes above and some of the notes below to kind of show the two voices. So just like the previous movement, play the lower voice a bit heavier and more resonant, and play the upper voice a little lighter. And experiment in your own practice, changing the colors between the two voices. Do this by working on various elements of your playing, including flexibility in your lips, and work on resonance in your mouth, chest, nasal cavity, and head, and try using different vowels also to help figure out which vowel works best for you to make the bass line the most effective. Now, if we go on to the next movement, which is the adagio. This is, again, following the sonata chiesa form. This is an example of a movement. This is an example of improvisation. And what do I mean by that? Well, at this time, usually, in general, the slow movements would be improvised. However, this particular movement already comes fully ornamented. So this really gives us an idea of what Telemann would be looking for and what a lot of musicians at this time might be doing with their ornamentation. So this is a very clear example of ornamentation in the German style. For example, Telemann varies the rhythms and uses unprepared dissonances and triplet figures. For example, if you have a look at the slide here on the screen, the upper line here is what's actually written, and the bottom line is a kind of simplification of what the skeletal notes might be. So if I play just the skeletal notes, it would sound kind of like this. Let me get my... Okay. Let me fix my own slide here. Here we go. So that is a simplified melody here. So now what I'd like to do is you can see in the second beat, in the bottom line there, we have simple 16th notes in duples. And what Telemann does is he turns these duples into triplets. And this is kind of a written out version of the ornamentation. So another thing he does is adding escape tones to ornament the lower voice line. For example, if you look at the F sharp in the second measure of the original, the first measure on the third beat of the upper line. So I'm going to go ahead and play this movement for you. And one more thing I'd like to point out before I play, if you see that there are some plus signs written above the notes, I don't know if it comes out in the slides. Yes, the plus signs are there. Basically, this means you should do a trill. So one more thing I'd like to mention here. When you have if we go on to the next slide, I believe it is. Yeah, go to the next slide. If you have these dotted figures, whenever we see, for example, an 8th note and a 16th note, or you have a 16th note with a 32nd note, you want to make sure to overdot these figures. and play. So that means you're going to hold the longer note a little longer than it's supposed to be, and then the faster, smaller note is going to be faster than you think, and it needs to be closer to the resolution note. We can go on now, I think, to the allegro. I'm just trying to check our time here. So the allegro, which is the final movement of this, is a French bourrée. And, well, what is a French bourrée? Well, a French bourrée was a popular peasant dance. It was usually written in 2/2 time signature or 2/4 time signature. And there is always a pickup note at the beginning, which you can, I'll show you that in a second, but there's always a pickup note which would be used to prepare your body to start moving when you dance. And then there's usually a rhythm involving long, short, short. So you have a long note followed by 2 short notes. And then the phrase is going to be 3 beats. Dun, da, da, dun, da, da. 1, 2, 3, like that. And this movement meets all the qualifications for a French bourrée. However, it is unique because it's quite complex harmonically for a dance like this. If we go to the next slide, I can point out all these elements to you. So here you see this starts with a pickup note. The first beat has the cellular structure of a long note followed by 2 short notes. It's written in 2/4 time signature, which means there are 2 beats in a measure. And you can see here it says 1, 2, 3 underneath of the staff. There are 3 beat phrases. So if we can go on to the next slide, there are a lot of chromatic passages in this, and you'll hear them when I play it. And we want to make sure to keep those chromatic passages moving, not to get too stuck, don't play too vertically there. Keep those moving forward. And follow the shapes of the notes. So if the notes go up, make a crescendo. If the notes go down, make a decrescendo. Or if the notes go up, give a little more energy. If the notes go down, relax a little bit. So I'll just play a little bit of this one for you as well. Excellent. Okay, so that finishes the Telemann Fantasy. And what I would like to do is just briefly now touch on the Bach Partita in A minor by Johann Sebastian Bach, who was also a Baroque composer. He lived around in the same time as Telemann, from 1685 to 1750. You can go on to the next slide. Yeah. And there are a few mysteries surrounding this piece. One of them being that we're not exactly sure when it was written. But what we do know is that it was written when Bach was Kapellmeister in Köthen in Germany, and that it was, or it could have been written when he moved to Leipzig in 1723. But we do know it was around that time. We're not exactly sure which city it was in or the exact year. The second mystery or question that arises surrounding this is whether or not Bach actually intended this partita to be for the flute. It's always a discussion that we have amongst flute players and violinists, because some say that the figures that Bach wrote are much more suited for the violin. And to some extent, I can see that, and it should totally be possible. And the writing is also quite continuous, which for flute is quite difficult because we have to breathe, and the violins don't have to do that in the same way that we do. I mean, of course, they have to breathe. Everybody has to breathe, but for us, it's a big part of our playing. So things that make sense of this being written for the flute would be that the registers and the tonal areas that Bach used are quite comfortable on the flute. So another big mystery surrounding this is that this piece does not actually exist in Bach's own handwriting. So we do know that two separate people were responsible for writing this out, as you can see here in the manuscript copy. But we do know pretty much for sure that it was not Bach who actually wrote it. So it's kind of a mystery. And despite all these mysteries, one thing that we do know for sure is that these movements, much like the last movement of the Telemann Fantasy, these movements also originated from actual dances. And these dances, particularly for this piece, were done during the 17th century in the court of Louis XIV in France. But by Bach's time, these pieces were no longer danced, and they were really meant to be played as concert pieces. And most Baroque movements express kind of a single affect or emotion, and often the title of the movement will give you a clue as to the kind of emotion or affect you should create when playing the movement. For example, if it says allegro, that means you have to play with a very cheerful and happy character. If it says dolce, you're going to play more sweet and charming and innocent. If it says grave, it's very serious. Furioso is very kind of angry and violent. So we can apply this to each of the movements in the partita, and for time purposes, I won't spend too much on this since it's from the same time period as the Telemann, but I just wanted to kind of, point some things out because this is such a substantial work in our repertoire. So if we go to the next slide, the first movement is called Allemand, which is a French word that actually translates to mean German. So this is meant to be a quite serious tone with kind of an almost ceremonious effect, kind of sacred feeling to it. And how can this be useful in knowing what tempo to play? Well, when we combine the mood or tone of the piece with other elements, such as key signature, the kind of note values that are used, and the steps that the dancers would use, it can help us really get a clear idea of the tempo. For example, the Allemand is written in C signature, for those of you who are musicians. It's written in C signature, which means that there are 4 beats in a measure, but the tempo should be a bit slower than 4/4, 2/4, or cut time. However, it's not slower in the way that you would think. I don't mean literally a slower speed. What I mean is that to create the effect of a slower tempo, you're going to focus more on bigger beats so that the tempo feels slower. For example, if we were to think of this in 4/4, I can just play 1 or 2 measures of it. It's very much a dance in 4/4. It seems a little happier and more uplifting. Okay, so if we shift that focus to every 2 beats, it's going to change the feeling and the kind of steps that the dancers will use. For example, in 4/4, the dancers are going to use more frequent steps that are quicker and smaller. But if we play with a bigger sense of beat, the steps are going to be larger, longer, less frequent, and slower dance steps. So this would in turn create a more stately and serious character to the dance itself. So it's a very different feeling from if you're really beating every quarter note. And another thing I like to point out is that this particular movement uses very quick note values, so we're using constant 16th notes. This also suggests that you might use a bit of a more reserved tempo as well, since it is quite notey, but still always keeping in mind these big beats. This idea is also emphasized by the fact that the harmony is shifting more or less every 2 beats, not every beat. I also often get the question of where to breathe in this move, not only in this movement, but the whole piece, but in this particular movement. I suggest you breathe after the ends of the phrases, breathe after the principal notes, and breathe in intervals that are larger than a second, and take frequent breaths. One thing I like to do is I like to practice breathing like a quick nose breath between every single note. It's a bit crazy, and it takes some practice to get used to. But it kind of sounds... So by doing that, I'm kind of training myself to take a breath wherever I want. So, and another thing you can do is practice breathing in the wrong places. And that will not only help you gain more flexibility with your breaths, but it will also really help you determine what are the right places to breathe. Going on to the second movement of this, which is called corrente. And corrente is an Italian word which means running. And this corrente it's considered to be the Italian version of the French dance, the courante. And this is a quick dance in 3, but there generally is emphasis on beat 1 as well as 3. The 18th century Italian version of this was a more virtuosic instrumental piece, and the French version was a bit slower. You can see here in the image on the screen, underneath of the staff you have 3/2 or 6/4. So this particular movement is written in 3/4. However, if we shift the meter and think of it more in 3/2, you can see that the movement of this can be much slower, and that follows more of the courante. So if I kind of emphasize, I'm going to play just this opening line for you, and I'm going to really do it in a 3/4 feeling, emphasizing every beat, and then I'm going to do one of the meters that's written underneath. Get my music here. So that's really feeling every beat, okay? Now if I shift to feeling every 2 beats, so 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Very different feeling. So the notes, in fact, feel and sound quite fast, but the dance rhythm of it is quite slow. Okay, so we can go on now to the next movement, which is the sarabande. You can go 2 more slides forward. Another one, yes, right there. So the sarabande is actually a passionate Spanish dance that could not be completely tamed by the French court. Writers and composers of this period called this dance a very slow and tender dance. And the sarabande dancers mix sliding steps, running steps, pirouettes, and leaps. And there's a lot of movement with the hands and the wrists as well. And the tempo for this is really important for the dancer because the dancer does a lot of movement on the ball of the foot, which, if you imagine that the fingers are your toes, it's kind of this part right at the base of your toes, and that's the ball of the foot. So the dancer spends a lot of time on the ball of the foot. So if you play this too slow, the balance is going to be quite difficult for the dancer. So I usually suggest a tempo between quarter note equals 64 to 73. However, here, if there are constant eighth notes, like Bach uses here, the tempo can be a little bit slower. And of course, obviously, if you're playing this with a dancer, it's going to be a different tempo than if you're playing this as a concert piece. In any case, the pulse should be kept pretty steady, and you want to emphasize the downbeats, and also when you have dotted quarter notes on the second beat, which we don't have, but I would like you just to look at the slide there that I have here. The image here is showing you kind of a simplified version of what Bach has done, and the rhythm of this 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3. So there's kind of this dotted feeling in the second beat. So we want to keep that in mind, even though we're playing constant eighth notes. Let's see. There's also a fantastic example of a dancer doing this on YouTube. I didn't get to put the link in, but if I have time to do it later and put it after in the chat, in the comments below, I'll do it. So remember that the dotted, if you have dotted notes, which we only have a couple here, they should be played a little more emphatically. So if you were a string player, the bow would be detached during the dot, and then the following eighth note would be articulated in a sharper manner. So for the flute, that means that we lift off of the dotted notes and play the following eighth note a little shorter. So I'll just play a little bit of this for you so you can kind of hear how it goes. So that's a little bit of the third movement. Going on to the last movement, which is entitled Bourrée Anglaise, which means English bourrée. We're having a lot of bourrées here today. In this suite, the bourrée takes the place of a jig, and the word English suggests that this bourrée was devised from an English jig. And this is a lively dance that generally has 3 quick steps in a bar. A jig tends to have more leaps and hops and skips and jumps than bourrées. So the tempo for a jig is, I would say, usually a little bit slower than a bourrée. Normally the tempo for this would be between quarter note equals 112 and 121, but it is possible for some bourrées to be as slow as quarter note equals 80 to 88. I personally tend to play these dance movements on the slower side just because I was a dancer myself when I was younger, so I really know what it takes to do all those the skips and leaps and jumps and hops, and I try to be as sensitive to the dancers as possible. Also, obviously, the more jumping and skipping you have to do, the slower you'll have to play in order to accommodate the dancers. So another thing to point out about this movement, if we go forward, yeah, we have the slide up already. Okay, is that the bourrée typically has a 2-measure feel to it, but this particular bourrée has more leaps in the notes than most bourrées would. And I just want to kind of play the opening so you can hear that this is their 2-bar phrases. Two measures. That's 4 measures, so it's a little longer at that part of the phrase. All right, so the 2-measure idea is right there in the beginning. Then if we go on to the next slide, I would like to just kind of show you what might happen if you played around with doing this as a jig as opposed to a bourrée. If you can go to the next slide and have a look at the bottom line there. If we were to take the opening of this and turn it into a jig, that's kind of what it would sound like. So it's kind of fun to play around with that, and it helps give you a better understanding of the character as well. Let me go ahead and just play a little bit of this, just the first part of this movement, so you can kind of get an idea of how this goes. And similarly to the Telemann Fantasy, you want to pay attention to the chromatic passages and move them forward, and also follow the same idea of shaping of the notes. If the notes go up, make a crescendo. If the notes go down, decrescendo. So that's the first part. And one other small thing I'd like to point out about this movement. If we go ahead a few slides. One more. Yeah, here. That the second, third, and fourth movements of this piece are all linked melodically. They kind of use there's a connection between the melodic material of these 3 movements, and you can see that each movement kind of starts with the same cluster of notes. So if the beginning of the corrente has the mi, la, si, do, re, and then you have the re passing tone, and then mi. And then the saraband starts la, si, do, we skip the re and go right to the mi. And then the bourrée starts with the same notes as the corrente. So it's kind of really pleasing to have this connection between those movements. And it really also sets apart the first movement. The first movement is quite unique, and it's one of my favorite movements of any piece to play, actually. So I hope you enjoyed hearing a little bit about Bach. And where do we go from here? That's the question. Well, for a while after this, there really were no pieces for solo flute written. Let's go on to, before I go on, I'm watching all of you here on my phone here, checking who's here, and I'm seeing all of your greetings, and please don't hesitate to write where you're from and where you live, and oh, hi to Sergio, Adriana, Elizabeth, Angel, hi Angel, Julio's here, Benny, Lynette, hi everybody, oh, so nice you all are here, Jesus Morales, hi, and my student all the way in Saudi Arabia, hello, my mother-in-law, hi, Karen, my student, my mother, hi mom. So I hope you all are enjoying the class, and please don't hesitate to comment if you have any questions, anything you'd like to add to what I'm saying. If you know something that I haven't said or something you want to add, please feel free to do that as well. Okay, so now we can move on to, Elena Yakovleva, my dear friend from Russia who's in the United States Navy Band. She's here too. She says hi to everyone. Okay, now we can go on to Syrinx by Claude Debussy. I'm sure a lot of you might be familiar with Claude Debussy. He was a French composer who lived from 1862 to 1918. He's considered one of the most influential composers of the late 19th and early 20th century. He has been referred to as the first kind of impressionist composer, but he really strongly rejected that term. And this particular piece is significant because it represents a pivotal moment in the development of solo wind music. At this time, there were very few pieces that were composed for unaccompanied wind instruments, and this piece kind of sets that in forward motion. So in regards to the flute, there are very few pieces written between Bach's Partita in A minor and Debussy's Syrinx. I think CPE Bach was written after that, and a few of the other smaller pieces I mentioned earlier. So I think one of the CPE Bach was written, I think, in 1747, so something like over 150 years before Syrinx was written. And at the time that Debussy wrote Syrinx, this means that the unaccompanied repertoire was really just starting, and it paved the way for composers such as Varese and Luciano Berio and Ibert. And this was really the first well-known solo flute piece of the 20th century. So it has, obviously, because of this, become a standard in our repertoire. And this was the first piece for solo flute to be premiered using the modern Bohm flute, which was a flute made more of metal versus of wood. Flutes before, in the Baroque day, Bach's time, were made of wood. So it's a completely different sound and way of producing the sound, and fingerings are totally different in everything. This piece was dedicated to a student of Paul Tuffanel at the Paris Conservatory, and only Louis Fleury was allowed to play this piece until it was first published in 1927. Every flutist has their own interpretation of how freely this piece should be played, and it's generally a discussion amongst flute players. Is, should you really follow the meter and tempo strictly, or should you be allowed to take some freedoms? And when I was studying at Yale with Ransom Wilson, I remember when he made us play all of this, even at the master's level, he made us do this in one of our studio classes, and he really insisted that we play this completely metronomically, and it really kind of changes your perspective on the piece if you're used to being a little more free. So what I like about this piece is that everyone can have their own unique interpretation and version of this piece. And this piece was originally written as an incidental music to a play called Psyche by Gabriel Moret. And the easiest way to understand the story is kind of, you can go on to the next slide, is kind of to go right to the poem that was the basis of Moret's play. And hi Ranier, thank you. The easiest way to sum up the story, here's the poem is a translation from Ovid's Metamorphoses, and I'll sum up for you what it means. So this poem is basically, this piece is a kind of a story of unrequited love between Pan and Syrinx. Pan was an ancient Greek god who was half man and half goat, and Syrinx was a young nymph, which is like a mythological nature spirit who appeared in the form of a woman. And Pan was kind of known for being a ladies' man, but he was very much, interested in Syrinx. And Unfortunately, Syrinx did not reciprocate in her feelings, so in order to escape his pursuits, Syrinx asked the river gods to help her. And they answered her call for help by transforming her into hollow water reeds. And Pan was kind of searching for her. He couldn't find her, and he was standing at the edge of the river, and he heard kind of the wind moving through these water reeds. And he was so moved by the sound of it that he bundled the reeds together and transformed them into a flute. And you can see here in the image what we would kind of call the pan flute now. And then he kind of plays a lament for Syrinx without really realizing that he actually had taken her and bundled her together and made her into a flute. So this story and this subject is it's really been told throughout history, not only in music, but in literature and art. It's been written about, and people have made music about it, and they have painted about it. So if we go to the next slide, I just want to show you a couple of paintings. This one is by Peter Paul Rubens and Jan Bruegel the Elder. And you see here, of course, you see Pan, going after Syrinx, and there's kind of a hint of a river there on the side. We can go to the next painting. It's also by Peter Paul Rubens and Jan Bruegel the Younger, which two different people. And this one, you see that Syrinx is a little more like, no, leave me alone, and Pan is always, he's very muscular, and he kind of really embodies the spirit of a god. And my favorite one, which is the one up on the screen right now, Noël, Nicolas, beautiful painting. I just love how he uses light to accentuate certain figures within the painting. The way the light is kind of on Pan and then on the Syrinx as she's kind of running away, and then there's just a little bit of light on the river gods that are helping her on the side. So let's just kind of leave that slide up for a minute so people can kind of take it in. And for me, this piece also really is about transformation. And Pan, who's half man, half goat, he's a transformation kind of caught in the middle, and he's not completely human anymore, but he's not completely goat. He's not entirely God. And then we have Syrinx, who of course is transformed from her corporeal form into a bunch of reeds, of water reeds, and then these water reeds, which are a plant, are transformed into a flute. And then the flute is transformed into the messenger or the deliverer of Pan's sorrow and pain. And then Pan's pain is turned into a song, and this song and this emotion is turned into art for me, which I think is kind of the ultimate metamorphosis. And this is one of my favorite pieces of the repertoire as well. Now I'm saying all of them are my favorite pieces. I said the Bach was my favorite, but it's also one of my favorites for different reasons. And so why don't I just go ahead and play this for you. The flute's a little cold. right, so that will conclude talking about Debussy's Syrinx. And I just want to briefly mention a few other pieces that kind of were signature pieces throughout the 20th century from this point. Arthur Honegger, Danse de la Chèvre, which is Dance of the Goat, from 1921. This piece was written as incidental music for a dancer, and Arthur Honegger was a French composer who was a member of Lessy, which was a group of 6 composers who were friends around the year 1920. So the next piece is from the same time as that, 3 Oriental pieces by Pierre-Octave Ferrou. And Ferrou was a fantastic composer who unfortunately died very young in a car accident, and he was a very good friend of Francis Poulenc. Unfortunately, he wrote very few pieces because he died so young. This piece has a lot of influences from the Orient. At the beginning of the 20th century in Paris, there was a lot of interest in the Far East because of the World Exposition. And a lot of composers were influenced by the paintings that they saw and the literature that they read. And this piece is kind of a great example of that. Why don't I just play just a couple measures of one of the movements of that so you can hear what it sounds like. This movement is called Jade, and this plays around a lot with the pentatonic scale. Really lovely piece, and I encourage you to go listen to the other movements as well. Following this, we have a couple of years, about 6 years, between this and Paul Hindemith, who wrote a fantastic piece called 8 Pieces for Solo Flute, Achtstücke. This piece, he wrote similar sets of unaccompanied pieces for other instruments, and what I love about this piece is that he has written down every single detail, every dynamic, every articulation, and I encourage, if you're learning this piece, I encourage you to really pay attention to all of those details, and don't forget to experiment and look for opportunities for color. It's a really fantastic piece. After that, about 10 years after that, we had Density 21.5 by Edgar Varèse. And this piece was written for the inauguration of Georges Barrère's platinum flute. And the title Density 21.5 refers to the actual density of platinum, which is 21.5. And this was actually the last piece that Varèse wrote for almost 20 years. He kind of really struggled with, the fact that he wasn't as successful as he had hoped. And obviously now, much later, he's quite successful, and his pieces are really admired and played throughout the world. And Varèse was suspicious of tonality. He really believed that he had a responsibility to create something new, and so he wanted to kind of break away from the traditional tonal concept of sound, and he really explores new ideas and ways to kind of portray space and time, and highlights the expressive and technical possibilities of the flute. After that, we have Jacques Ibert, who wrote a piece for solo flute called Pièce, and it was written the same year as Density 21.5. And it was written and premiered by Marcel Moyes at actually a dinner party after the premiere of Ibert's Flute Concerto. And the piece actually includes fragments of the third movement of Ibert's Flute Concerto. And after that, a few years later, we have Eugene Botza wrote a piece called Image for solo flute, which was also dedicated to Marcel Moyes. Marcel Moyes, for those of you who don't know, is really considered the father of the concept of the French flute school. And in this piece, Botza explores the tendency of the flute to kind of portray pastoral music and perform pastoral music. So this piece is actually quite awkward to play because he uses various techniques that create more of an effect rather than using them because they sound good on the flute. So we have to work and pay very careful attention to making sure that this doesn't sound awkward. And I recommend that all of you practice this slowly and working to have the most beautiful sound that you can on every note, because some of the intervals are quite awkward, and there are a lot of disjunct melodies. And don't be afraid to also explore the dance side to the faster section of this piece. Botza uses a lot of compound meters and dotted rhythms as well. After this, we have about, 18 years later, we have Luciano Berio's Sequenza, which is a staple for our repertoire as well. And it was premiered by Severino Gazzelloni, an Italian flutist. And this sequenza is actually the first of a series of 13 sequenzas that were written for solo instruments. He also wrote a sequenza for harp, mezzo-soprano, piano, trombone, viola, oboe, violin, clarinet, trumpet, bassoon, alto saxophone, and accordion. And the Berio sequenza really explores the virtuosic potential of the flute, and it was the first piece that he wrote in proportional notation, meaning that there's no notated meter, and the rhythms are indicated based on their placement on the page. And measures are indicated with little tick marks. So it takes some time when you're first learning it to get used to this. And Berio also wrote another version a bit later where he actually wrote it in standard notation, for those of you who prefer to read it like that. And this was actually one of the first pieces to require extended techniques on the flute. It required multiphonics and other techniques such as key clicking and flutter tonguing. So we'll talk about some of those techniques in my final piece that I'm going to talk about later on. And then after that, we have some Japanese composers. Fukushima wrote a piece called Mai, also for this premiere by the same guy who premiered Berio Sequenza, Severino Gazzelloni, at the 25th Festival of Contemporary Music in Venice, Italy. And this piece was written for Dr. Wolfgang Steinecke of Darmstadt, who died in a tragic accident. And according to ancient Japanese legend, it is believed that the sound of the flute has the power to reach the dead. So Fukushima was really trying to reach his friend through this music. And this piece also uses extended techniques. Toru Takamitsu wrote a piece called Voice in 1971, which also uses extended techniques of key clicks, multiphonics, glissandos, pitch bending, flutter tonguing, and all of these kinds of effects, which we'll get to very soon. And then after that, we had Elliott Carter, who wrote Scrivo and Vento for solo flute in 1991, and it was dedicated to his friend and flutist Robert Aitken. And Robert Aitken also wrote a great piece for solo flute called Icicles. And this piece, Scrivo and Vento, takes its title from a poem of Petrarch. And in this piece, the composer uses extreme registral contrast and extreme contrasting musical ideas to kind of represent the paradoxical nature of the poem and to kind of show struggle and opposition. So I encourage you to check out all of these pieces as well. Moving on from that, the next piece I'd like to talk about, the next two pieces, the final two pieces, are a little more recent. The next composer is Catherine Hoover. And Catherine Hoover recently passed away in 2018. And her music has also become so important for the flute repertoire. And, you know, she was a flutist herself. I believe this is on slide, let me see what slide we're on now, 38. She was a flutist herself, studying at Eastman School of Music and later Manhattan School of Music. She studied with Joseph Mariano, William Kincaid, and she also began composing while she was at Eastman. At that time, she was really unaware of any kind of outstanding female composers, so she was more influenced at the time of the styles of Paul Hindemith and Bartók as well. As a composer, if we go to the next slide, this is a direct quote from her. She said, "As a composer, it is a great advantage to be good in an instrument, to understand in depth what making music on a high level is about. It encourages respect for your performers and their needs." What makes Catherine's pieces so great and fun to play is that since she was a flute player, she really knows how to write for the flute. And Catherine is often inspired by, in her music, she's inspired by when she wrote, she was inspired by characters, events, and other people's music, and even other composers. She typically has a descriptive narrative element to her pieces. It kind of helps give the listener and the performer insight into what the music is attempting to express. For example, the piece I'm going to play for you now is called Winter Spirits. And hi, Eugenia, hi. So nice to see all of you online here. Welcome. Where was I? I lost my train of thought. Yes, so the piece I'm going to play for you, Winter Spirits. I would like to just kind of read for you what she wrote on the back of the sheet music. So if we go to slide 40, yeah, this is what is written on the back of the sheet music, and there is a picture by an artist named Marie Butchfink, and the picture is of a Native American flute player. And on the back of the book it says, on the sheet music it says, "From the flute rises a cloud of kachinas and totem spirits. This piece has also risen from his notes, and it is indeed influenced by Native American music. The idea of the flute invoking beneficial spirits, be they kachinas or any others, is a very natural one. Such spirits are an accepted and valued part of life in most of the world, and the flute has been used to honor and invite their presence for countless ages." So, Catherine wrote this piece. If you go to the next slide, here is the picture that the sheet music is referencing, and you can see at the bottom that there's a flute player, and from his flute is arising all these different spirits. So he's using the notes of his flute to kind of invoke all of these spirits. And Catherine Hoover was really influenced by the sounds of Native American instruments, as well as the tribes of the American Southwest. And she was also very inspired by this artist. And I just want to show you a couple other of the pictures and paintings that she's done. You can go to the next slide. So you can kind of, they're really beautiful. This one is called, I didn't have the name for this one. But if you go to the next one, Sentinel. Beautiful one as well. And then Lobo. That's what I call my dog. I call her my Lobo. She's a white German Shepherd. And then the last one here is it's gorgeous. So if you go one more, back to the original one here, the kachina. And what is a kachina? Well, a kachina is a spirit. And to the tribes of the American Southwest, kachinas are supernatural beings who visit the villages to help the people with everyday activities. And they also act as a link between gods and mortals. And these spirits are kind of impersonated in different forms. For example, if you go to the next slide, these spirits are impersonated sometimes by men who dress up in costumes and perform ceremonial dances. So you can see here a ceremonial dance that was done sometime before 1900 in Arizona. And then if you go to the next slide, these spirits are also portrayed in the form of dolls. So, the dolls are usually small, brightly painted, and they're usually made of some kind of wood. And these dolls are usually given to children, but they're not given as toys. They're usually given as objects for the children to care for and to study and to learn from, so that the children know what the different kachinas or the different spirits look like. So now we can talk a little bit about the structure of this piece, because I think it is really going to help you as a listener get a clear image of what's happening. So we have the introduction here, and the introduction, which is the first two lines, you can kind of see this as the invocation of the spirits that are represented within the work. So here, the kachina, the flute player is kind of calling all the spirits to come. And if we go now to the next slide, we have the first section, which for those of you who know the sheet music, it's going to be the next 4 lines or so. And this gives rise to the first spirit, who is quite playful. So the notes here should really dance. And the grace note Ds should be very crisply articulated. And the Cs, or the do naturals that begin the group of 32nd notes, or fusas, the do natural that has the accent, those should be kind of forcefully tongued, just a little bit. And once we get to the 16th note passage, a little bit later on in that, the spirit is kind of more free. So the spirit kind of shifts a little bit and becomes a little more free. So you want to avoid accents there. So if we go to the next slide, after we get through that section, you're going to hear kind of a return to a long note. And it kind of simulates the beginning, the introduction to the piece. And this transition is used to suggest the departure of that spirit that we just had, the more playful one, and kind of is invoking a new spirit. So here on this side, we have the transition and the departure of one spirit and the entrance of the next spirit, which is a bit more capricious. So there's a lot more tonguing in the flute, and there are 3 phrases that happen within this, so 3 articulated phrases, so you'll hear those clearly as well. Then if we go on to the next slide, we have another transition, which is kind of the last 2 measures of the 10th line of the piece, where it says tempo 1. And this is kind of, also saying goodbye to the previous spirit and calling forth a calmer spirit, with using longer notes and softer dynamics. And the grace notes here should be played more smoothly. The grace notes should move more smoothly to the long notes with no break in the sound. And this kind of invokes the next spirit in the next slide of the adagio. And so the spirit here is much calmer now. Maybe this is someone who's a bit wiser, someone, a very wise, calm spirit. So you want to start this with no edge in the sound and play quite simply. And the melody here is heard 4 times. So you're going to want to use a bit more vibrato for each repetition. And each repetition of this theme should be a little more intense as well. And notice that this has 2 parts. So it has kind of like a long notes, and then there's kind of a bum 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 bum. It's kind of like a repeated note, and this acts kind of like as a heartbeat. So it should be very steady without emphasizing any particular note. And then after we get through that, which is kind of like, you know, the climax of the piece, we get to another transition. So that spirit is departing now, and I think it's the last measure of line 16. And so you have another transition here, which you see there. Oh no, go back. Yeah, at the top there we have transition to the adagio, and then we can go to the next slide. Then we have a return, kind of back to the material from the introduction, which is kind of preparing us for the conclusion of the piece, and the spirits, kind of showing that the spirits are kind of done talking to us for now. And with that, if you go to the next slide, the final line, the coda, the very end of the piece, is kind of signaling the departure of all the spirits. And this piece ends with a flourish at the end and an accent to kind of suggest that the spirits just suddenly disappear all at once. So I'm going to go ahead and play this for you. Okay, so the final piece I'd like to talk about today is by a British composer named Ian Clark, who is a living composer. And Ian Clark, much like Catherine Hoover, like Telemann, is also a flutist. And he was raised listening to classical music, but he became fascinated with rock music when he started listening to Pink Floyd, and he founded a rock band with his friends and started doing a lot of improvising. And when asked about his rock band, if we go to slide 57, so you can kind of see here, this is Ian Clark here, yeah. And when asked about his rock band, he said that being creative with his mates started to push him outside of the normal classical track. And it was through this experience that he discovered what a blues scale was. While in college, Ian Clark studied mathematics and flute while continuing to play in his rock band. And his band actually had a chance to record an album in 1968 called Environmental Images. And the producers were constantly asking Ian to experiment with creating a variety of non-traditional sounds on the flute during the recording sessions. So Ian tried to imitate the sounds that his friends were making on their guitars and their synthesizers. So although a lot of his works are influenced by popular music and rock flutist Ian Anderson of Jethro Tull, he's also influenced by more traditionally classical artists such as Karlheinz Stockhausen and, of course, the Robert Dick, who's another fantastic flutist. So now I want to talk about those extended techniques that we were talking about earlier when we were discussing Berio and Fukushima and Takamitsu. Again, extended techniques are sounds or effects that the flute normally doesn't do. Now they have become kind of standard techniques in our repertoire, and I hope everyone can learn how to do them from this. Some of the techniques we're going to talk about, if we can go to the next slide after that. The first, well now we skip this one. Go to the next one. 2 ahead. One more, there we go. So the first thing is the residual breathy tones. So what is that exactly? Well, this is the breathy noise of the flute that is left when a proper tone is not formed. So this is usually notated with an open slash note head. And the purpose of this, in this particular piece, which is called The Great Train Race, the purpose of this effect and sound was to create an image of a steam train beginning its race along the tracks. So to achieve this effect, you want to kind of bring your jaw a bit up and forward so that the bottom teeth almost kind of touch the front of the top teeth so that you close the gap between the upper and the lower teeth. Kind of sounds... It's kind of what it sounds like. So again, you see the lips are not forming a traditional embouchure. And it takes a little practice, of course, to get used to all of these effects. Another effect that he uses a lot in this piece is vocal glissando. So if we go to the next slide, is basically where, generally in this technique, the voice is singing 1 octave below the flute. And this effect in this case is so fast that you're not going to hear every note. It's kind of more just like, and then that's kind of the glissando. You play all the notes. And that's the effect that you're going to get with that. We move on to the next slide. Multiphonics. So multiphonics were first used by Berio in sequenza back around 1940-ish. And basically this is where we play more than 1 note simultaneously. And this is usually done with special fingerings and a lot of practice. Multiphonics require a significant amount of control and stamina from the performer, and the goal is to hear both notes. So I would suggest that when you're first tackling this, that you practice playing each of the notes separately so that you know what to listen for. So you play the real fingering. So if you look here at this example, normal, and then you're going to play, so we're going to have the A, E, 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 and now we're going to play A, C sharp, E, C sharp, the bottom note there. So then you see this kind of flute keys turn on the side, and that is a special fingering that you're going to use to make both of the notes come out at the same time. So let me just remember. There it is. So usually when you're starting, one note is going to be stronger than the other. So you have to kind of work to adjust so that both notes are equally loud in volume. The big moment here, if I go down and play the second line, it's the same effect, and it's kind of supposed to stimulate, it's to kind of suggest the train getting faster and faster. Like that. That's how it sounds. Okay, so the big effect, all of this train speeding up in this section of the piece that you're going to hear leads to the steam whistle effect. And this is the big moment of the piece, which is done by combining multiphonics with note bending. And you can do the note bending either with rolling the head joint in and out or lifting the head up and down. But there should be lip and head movement. So it's kind of, both things are going to be required. And you want to try to maintain the octaves as much as possible. And it'll also work better if you move quicker through the first bend. So again, you have a special fingering for this. Sounds like that. All right. Then after that, I'm following these techniques in order of the piece, so you'll know they're going to be appearing in this order when I play the actual piece. The next effect we use is singing and playing at the same time. And Ian Clark specifies that the singing should be done in octaves, and the voice should be one octave lower than the flute. Kind of in that octave there, so there. All right. So first, if you're new to this, I would suggest learning the melody by singing. Well, first you have to play it in flute to know how it sounds, and then you're going to practice singing the melody by itself without the flute. And then you're going to gradually add the flute tone to your voice, and then the voice is going to transition into sounding more like a hum. All right. So let me just demonstrate this one for you. That's that effect there. All right. And then if we go to the next slide here, basically these are timbral trills, meaning they have special fingerings to make them sound more like a color rather than a pitch, and so you're kind of, this basically has three pitches that total a half step: E flat, D quarter sharp, and C double sharp. And again, this is all about color and effect. If he only wanted you to trill on one note, it would be like the image of the trill on the right side of the screen. So that'd be more. But here he kind of wants. So it sounds, the distance between the notes is so small that it just creates this effect instead. All right, so that gives you kind of an idea of these extended techniques and how they sounded. And I'm going to go ahead to close this out. I'm going to play this piece for you, and I hope that my foot pedal is finally working in my iPad. Yeah, it's working. So let's see if this technology holds out. I kind of just play samples of everything and see how it goes. Fun piece, very fun piece. And it takes quite a bit of time to get used to all these new fingerings, and I encourage all of you to have a look at this piece. It's really fun. And that will conclude our presentation for today. I would like to thank all of you for tuning in and listening, and I hope that this information has been very helpful to all of you. Again, I would like to thank Proarte Musical and Fundación Ángel Ramos for having me here today. And does anybody have any questions before we finish? If you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the live feed here. Wait a minute or two. Don't be shy. There are no silly questions. No? You can go to the last slide, honey. Just so they can kind of see. Well, if you do have any questions and they come to you later at any time, please don't hesitate to to contact me, you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. You can also check out my studio page, Live Performing Arts Studio. And yeah, anybody have any questions? No? Great. Well, thank you. All have been a wonderful audience, and I hope you have a wonderful afternoon and a wonderful summer.